So, first up here is Frank Stampfl. Welcome, Frank. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Nick. How's everything with you?
Not too bad. So, according to Fantasy Pros, Frank Stampfl is the top 10 fantasy baseball analyst on rankings. Frank is also the host of the Fantasy Baseball Today podcast, as well as a member of the prestigious Tout Wars competition. You can find Frank on Twitter at RotoFrank. Good to see you, man.
I'm excited, man. I'm happy to be here. This is awesome that you've what you've put together here. The fact that you're raising as much money as you are, it's a great cause. I've checked in on a ton of the conversations over the past couple of days, heard some really fun and interesting things. So I'm just happy to be here, and frankly, happy to be broadcasting with Justin Mason. This is my first time ever doing that.
That should be a lot of fun. All right, we're going to bring in the next guy, and that is Rudy Gamble. How you doing, Rudy?
How's it going?
It's going all right. So if you don't know Rudy Gamble, he's the co-founder of Razzball. Rudy is the Tom Glavine who grazed Javi Lopez. Rudy is the back-to-back 15 Tout champion, as well as creator of various MLB, NFL, and NBA projection systems and tools. Rudy's player rater over at Razzball is largely considered to be one of the best in the industry. You can find Rudy on Twitter at Rudy Gamble. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so next up is Scott Chu. Welcome, Scott.
Yo.
So Scott is a going league manager at Pinterest, as well as a frequent contributor. He's also a writer and podcaster with friends with fantasy benefits, and creator of Fantasy Curling, which was featured inside of the Wall Street Journal. So take that picture list, of course. You can find Scott at If the Chu Fits. Definitely give him a call. Welcome, Chu.
Just glad to be here.
Well, we're getting a little bit of echo somewhere. We got to figure that one out. Next up is Justin Mason. Justin is in the fantasy community. Well, Justin, I gotta say this about you. It wouldn't be the same without having you here in the first place. And seeing your smoke rise up as well as you talk, fantastic. The fantasy community is also lauded for its inclusiveness and camaraderie. That starts and ends with Justin Mason, who has long been one of the most charitable, friendly, and incorporative human beings in the fantasy baseball industry. He is the co-owner of Friends with Fantasy Benefits, the creator of TGFBI, the co-host of the Sleeper in the Bus with Fangraphs, an FSWA award winner, and owner of more shirts with his name on it than anyone else in the world. You can find him on Twitter at Justin Mason FSWA. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here, and what should be a really fun panel.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be great. And last but not least, we have Brad Johnson. Welcome, Brad.
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you, man. Brad Johnson is the founder of the Baseball A-Team and is dedicated to providing pure and unadulterated thoughts and advice on fantasy baseball. You can join the Baseball A-Team community at patreon.com/baseball-A-team. You can find Brad on Twitter at Baseball A-Team. Welcome. What is that shirt?
Oh, it's Mushroom Kingdom weather forecast.
That is fantastic. All right. I am not going to take up any more of your time. I've been looking forward to this panel all weekend. I'm going to let you guys take it away. Thanks again for being a part of PitchCon.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. Thanks for having us here, Nick. Very excited to be here. And Justin, before we get started, I was going to ask you if we were going to get the stogie or if we were going to get, you in a swimsuit or something. So I'm happy you came in.
I have come prepared, my friend. So, give me a second and I can, Oh,
there we go.
Bought a brand new green screen. So, yeah, I've got plenty of backdrops prepared for today.
Yeah, I assumed you were just going to peel. You had 20 Justin Mason shirts. You're just going to peel them off one by one.
I did that at Tout Wars.
Like an onion.
I did that at Tout Wars one year. I sat next to Gray at NL Tout, and I just changed shirts every 5 minutes.
Oh, man, that's awesome. All right, so in-season management, that's what we're here to talk about. Everybody loves the draft, and rightfully so, but in-season is where the fun really begins, boys. It's such a grind. A normal season, 162 games, 6 long months. There's a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. Look, if you guys, just a heads up, if you don't need me to call on you, if you just want to, interject and make a certain point, just feel free to just... I'm all here for I'm all for as much chaos as we could possibly cause here. But let's start with this. How do you guys generally approach in-season management in relation to draft prep? Do you look for a lot of the same things that you're normally using during draft prep? Are you using the same stats? What goes into your draft prep versus your weekly lineup prep? Let's start with you, Rudy.
So, I mean, my draft prep and my in-season is kind of similar in that I'm looking for the most brutally efficient process possible. It's like I only have so many hours in a day. And so the thing with the draft, though, is that it's hard to beat anybody in the draft in that people have months to prepare. So even if they're let's say I'm more efficient than everyone else, and smart and all that, but they'll eventually get to the same place I do for the most part with it because they have enough months to prepare. But in season is where efficiency helps. So to me, having a really smart process every week, one that's repeatable, one that doesn't wear you out, is the difference between just playing fantasy and like putting yourself in a great position to win.
I think for me, I like Rudy and like a lot of other people in the industry, start off my draft prep super early. So like the season hasn't even finished, in 2019, and I'm already working on 2020 draft prep. But the in-season management portion of things, like if you're going to start your draft prep early, you should start your in-season management prep early as well. And so as soon as I can, typically, I finish my draft prep in late December, early January, and then I'm just tweaking things as, different pieces of news come out, injuries hit, and then I kind of transition to, getting prepared. As I'm doing drafts, I'm making sure I'm organized, making sure I have a spreadsheet for each individual team to make things easy for me to track in season. Because if you're anything like me and you play in a ton of leagues, I usually play in, anywhere from 15 to 30 fantasy baseball leagues. I'm not going to remember which team I drafted Luis Severino on off the top of my head. Unless it's, a huge money league or a league, that's at the top of my priority list. But ultimately, I've got to make sure I'm organized. And I think a lot of people don't come into a season organized with everything set up for them to make those necessary moves.
Now, I think that's a really good point that you bring up there, Justin, because I actually had to attach a Post-it note to my laptop to remind myself of all the leagues that I'm in, all the lineups that I have to set, all the fab, all the waivers that I have to run. And it's a grueling process. I mean, we're going to talk about fab a little bit later on, but I mean, weekly fab on Sundays when you have to put in bids for, my head is just spinning imagining you with 15 to 30 teams, which is just crazy. So yeah, I think, having that organization is definitely a place where you do have to start because it's hard enough to manage one baseball team, let alone, 15 fantasy baseball teams.
Yeah. And, one of the things that really stands out to me in terms of, relating being ready for a draft and in the regular season is, to me, my in-season management looks a lot like my late draft, especially in terms of the queue. In drafts, like most people I know use the queue, right? They fill up that queue with all kinds of names they want. And then a lot of players that I get to talk to don't do the same thing in season. They don't keep a watch list, right? And to me, that's like the biggest mistake you can make. And that's something you've got to take from your drafts into regular season. You can't think about every player that might be available in every league you're in, right? That's way too large of a pool. And the difference in season is a lot of times you're thinking about a lot smaller pools of players. What positions are you looking for on your teams? In draft, you kind of get to think about everybody. You rank everybody. You might do that a little bit in season, but a lot of times in season, you're like, what I want to know is these are the types of guys I'll need and the types of guys that might be coming up soon. That's my watch list. That's what I'm really keeping an eye on. I'm watching the stock on those guys, so I know it's time to pounce on this guy on my watch list now, or I can wait, or how much am I going to spend? But you've got to limit it, especially when you're insane like Justin doing 15 to 30 leagues, which I'm not going to lie, that sounds low for you, man.
I've definitely cut back. I think I'm only in 19 leagues this year. And, obviously some people in the chat are like, oh my God, that's too many leagues. Obviously I play in a lot of deeper leagues too. I play in a lot of dynasty leagues where the in-season management are not going to be as difficult as, say my NFBC leagues or the Barf League, which is a daily moves league, So I'm in a ton of leagues, but I also get paid to do this. So like I I've carved out that extra time. My wife just said it's too many leagues.
Brad, what's going on, man? It's our first time working here together. What kind of things are you looking at in season versus draft prep? How did some of those things change for you?
It comes down to two things for me. I think it's going to sound a lot like what the others have said. You have different stages of the offseason. You have the part where everything's kind of static and nothing's really moving, and you can kind of figure out what you think the whole landscape is. And then things start to happen. And that's when in season really starts. It's when in spring training, you're getting enough information to start changing people and your assessment of where they fall, how you would use them. So to go with a lot of the points that have been made already, you got to keep going with it and keep staying on top of your changes and your watch lists, and be ready to pounce when the time's necessary.
We're going to hit a bunch of different game theory, basically, type things that that you should look at in season. And I want to start with specifically hitters and how long to stick with hitters. And I find this so fascinating too. To me, it's kind of like a sliding scale where, the earlier you draft a player or a hitter in particular, it's like the longer the leash has to be, where if a guy is struggling, halfway into the season, you kind of just have to ride it out. And I think a perfect example of this was last year with Jose Ramirez. He was a first round pick for a lot of people, and you felt like you can't drop him because the first 80 games, which is basically half the season, he was hitting .215 with 5 home runs. I mean, the only thing that saved him was the fact that he had 18 steals at the time. And then if you did finally, I don't think anyone dropped him, but if you tried to sell low on him, you missed out on when he went ballistic. So, how do you kind of weigh that, Rudy? We'll start with you here. When it comes to hitters, how long do you stick with a hitter? Because it feels like even if you have a first-round hitter who's struggling, you're stubborn and you want to stick with that player.
So I think... Yeah, I think you're right that in general, the higher you draft them, the more likely you're going to stick with them. But I think a good way of thinking of each player is that you've built certain assumptions. You've built their playing time, and you've built where they're going to hit in the lineup. And, if a player fundamentally changes on those two, so let's say a guy that you thought was going to be an everyday player, suddenly he's basically 3 days a week. So let's just say like Garrett Hampson last year. The reality was you had to drop him if you held him past April, you were kind of a gump because it was clear he wasn't getting that role, and you were kind of So, to me, every bench spot is vital because I want to rotate guys in and out. I want every week to be one where I could take advantage of streaming a hitter or a pitcher. So I think once those fundamentals change, it doesn't matter where you drafted him. It'd be really rare for a first rounder for those things to change. For Jose Ramirez, those things didn't change. It was just the performance was low, and I'll be willing to give more of a leash on performance. But if the fundamental batting order and playing time change, or an injury that would sap what you expected. So if basically you found out a guy you thought was going to be a 30 homer guy has a persistent wrist or shoulder injury where he's not hitting for power in the first half, that would be another thing that I'd be willing to move much quicker than you normally would for where you drafted them.
Scott, how do you weigh that? How do you weigh, holding on to a first-round hitter like a Jose Ramirez who's struggling versus, if it's someone that you just drafted late, are you willing to give up on that player, a couple of weeks into the season? Someone like Garrett Hampson, who Rudy mentioned, where you just can't afford to wait, even though the guy has upside. You can't really afford to keep him on your bench because then you're missing out on other players who are potentially breaking out early on in the season.
Yeah, and I think Rudy, hit a lot of the really key points here. I think the ones that I would kind of highlight for me is one, don't forget about your bench. Like your options aren't keep Jose Ramirez, drop Jose Ramirez, right? He's allowed to sit on your bench. And missing a week of production, stinks if he suddenly breaks out that moment, especially in a weekly league. But it's okay to bench these guys. Like just because they're doing bad doesn't mean they have to be doing bad for you, right? The other thing I'd point out is not only Rudy did a good job talking about the context on their team. I also have to think about the context for them on my team. What did I get them for, right? And one example for me is like my 4th and 5th outfielders, you know, a guy I picked up with some power and mediocre batting average. I'm churning those guys constantly, right? Yeah, I might drop one who ends up taking off, but I grabbed these guys and burned and churned them because that resource, that thing, that outfielder who can hit for some power with an okay average, there's a bunch of those depending on your format, right? Like even in 15 teamers, you can find outfilders. I'm not going to hang around to some guy because I think he could hit 20 homers this year, right? He's got to go. Whereas other assets, I have to be a little more patient with. I know a guy who I try not to draft because this happens, but Delino DeShields, like usually at some point in the late offseason starts taking off. Oh, Delino DeShields might be the leadoff guy. And I drafted him because I needed him to anchor my stolen bases. You're stuck holding that for a little longer because you might not have that resource available to you on the wire or on your bench. But that doesn't, I mean, Delino DeShields can hit your bench if you want, if he's just killing you elsewhere. But again, it's all about what I got them for and when can I replace it and how can I replace it? If I can replace, you know, if a speed guy shows up on my wire and I'm holding on to Delino DeShields last year, a lot of times I'm like, all right, see you, Delino. This guy's actually doing something. I'll replace him. But that's a huge thing for me. It's why do I have him in the first place? Why did I pick him up?
Justin, how much do, categories come into play? You heard Scott mention it there where, all right, well, I need speed. Let me just hold on to Delino DeShields in case he, earns everyday playing time or, something similar in terms of, I think this reliever might end up being the closer for the team and I really need saves. How much does that factor into your decision as well?
I mean, it definitely factors in decision, but this is one of the reasons why most people want to build their rosters with balance. Obviously, if you punted a category, you then, let's say you for some reason punted, saves. Well, then your stolen base guys that you paid a premium for, they need to perform and you can't necessarily just move on and cut. But again, like Scott said, like that's what the reserve list, that's what your bench is for, to rotate those guys in and out. They don't need to be sucking down, your batting average or hurting you in runs and RBIs and home runs. At the same time, this year we're going to have to be even quicker on the trigger. I mean, we're talking about potentially an 80 to 100 game season. And typically, you say, or I've heard in the industry that, people will say like, okay, well, if you got them in the last round, they get a week. Well, that now drops to half a week. Like, and if you start moving, progressively up, you're just going to have to be twice as quick on the trigger with guys. And I mean, I know for me, that's a weakness. I tend to be very conservative early on in a season in terms of fab and moving on from guys. And I think this is the year that we're going to have to kind of do a 180 on that if you play it a bit more conservative like I tend to do.
Brad, do you have a timetable in mind when it comes to, all right, if I'm stashing this prospect because I think he has upside, I'm stashing like a Ryan Mountcastle waiting for him to get called up. How long can you afford to stash someone like that? Or is it just going to be, dependent on, every situation is different based on like your roster construction type thing? Is there like a timetable that you have in mind, how long you're willing to wait on a specific player or prospect?
Honestly, I think most decisions that I make are case-by-case basis. So you got a guy like Mountcastle. I'm not particularly high on him. Like he interests me. I'd like to see what he'll do, but I'm pretty open to moving on from him if someone else pops up. And one of the things I really look for are the untouted prospects. So you got a guy like Zach Gallen come along the wire. I'm going to grab him and discard Mountcastle. If you're talking about maybe a bigger name, Joe Adele, I'll say. That's someone who I'm probably going to be more patient with. But to Justin's point, this year in particular, I'm a little wary of prospects in general unless I'm getting good signal that they're going to be used.
I think this is the year, though, that we're going to have a little bit more clarity, especially if they do go with these taxi squads. You're going to know who's on that taxi squad day one.
True.
And they're not going to put a guy on a taxi squad and then not play him because they're going to give that player a year of service time. So like this, in terms of figuring out the prospect side of things, I think this may be work to the fantasy player's benefit, kind of the strange and different rules as opposed to having to wait until a guy crosses, a certain threshold before he can be called up. I think a lot of that stuff's going to get blown out of the water, and teams that are going to be using their prospects are going to have them on that taxi squad or up day one or pretty close to it. And other teams, For instance, the Orioles and Mountcastle, like, why would you start his clock in a shortened season? Just keep him down for half a year, and we'll see you in 2021.
Rudy.
Well, yeah, especially the Athletics. I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Rudy.
Don't worry about any Athletics prospects. Either they're on that roster or they're not getting paid.
Poor guys, man. Too soon, Rudy. When it comes to streaming pictures, Rudy, it's something that we all do regardless of league size, regardless of format. Like, streaming pictures is always going to be a thing, whether it's a single-star pitcher, whether it's a two-star pitcher. This is a loaded question, but how do you go about figuring out pitchers to stream? Is it just, okay, let me stream a pitcher? I'm sorry, Jason. Again, Justin. I'm sorry, Justin. Do I just stream a hitter against a pitcher against the Giants because they are a terrible offense?
How dare you?
I'm sorry, Scott. Do you just stream a pitcher against the Tigers because their offense stinks? Like, how much of it is looking at the offense a pitcher is facing versus the actual talent of the pitcher? Because I feel like you have to weigh both of those things.
Yeah. Well, this is where, like I was saying, the process comes in. So I'm in charge of the weekly projections. So I've already got a process that's taking the weekly stats and putting a dollar figure on them. So when I go in Friday, and it starts running on Friday because it's hard to project pitchers much more than 10 days in advance. So I've already basically got dollar figures telling me who I should be looking at. Because it gets to the point of like, if you have to analyze so much and make all those decisions, it gets really dizzying. And occasionally then you'll miss that one guy who just happened to be dropped last week and he wasn't on your radar. So I'm basically going in each week thinking like, I know who's owned. Who isn't owned and who looks valuable. And then how does that compare to who's on my roster? And anyone who's basically on my roster, like on a pitcher side, yeah, that last one or a couple pitchers, as Scott was saying, the last couple pitchers I have are pretty much malleable. So if it's a week where they look awful and there's a guy who's a 2-star guy that looks okay, or even a 1-star guy, I'm just churning from the first week on, or I guess second week. I'll give the first week, I'll let them play, and then second week on, I'll just churn based, and it's so much based on the matchup, and it's pretty much based on matchup and what I'm projecting it for.
I think this year is going to be an interesting year too because of the 80-game schedule and the chances that we may be seeing more doubleheaders than we traditionally do, and teams all going to be operating a little bit differently. Instead of attacking, the bad teams, obviously everybody's going to try to attack the Giants. They're going to, try to attack the Mariners. They're going to try to attack the Orioles and the Tigers. At the same time, I think you're going to find maybe a little bit better success kind of attacking the teams that aren't going to be doing a lot of bullpen games, that aren't going to be babying their pitchers. There's already been some managers that have come out and said, hey, shortened season, we don't have to worry about innings limits with these guys. We can push them, but they're going to be teams like the Rays and the A's that really, really use these bullpens creatively. And that's going to be a huge headache if you're trying to stream, especially for wins, to be able to do that. And so it's going to be a lot of, we talked earlier about doing the in-season management prep before the start of the season. The first 2 weeks of the season are going to be really vital for people to learn information on how these teams are operating. And that doesn't leave a ton of time left in the season because typically, first 2 weeks, if you fall behind, that's not a big deal. But now, like 2 weeks is a huge deal. It's the equivalent to a month. So people are going to have to be very, very on top of things in terms of seeing managing tendencies and seeing how they're using bullpens.
Scott, we heard Justin mention, pitchers being babied. And, that kind of raises the question and something that I've thought about. Are 2-star pitchers kind of a dying breed now? Like trying to stream 2-star pitchers because pitchers typically are not going as deep into games. Younger pitchers are being handled with kids' gloves. And And it feels like so many things are constantly changing the past couple of seasons in particular throughout the course of a week, where someone could get pushed back, a team opts to go for, a 6-man rotation. And it's like, it just feels like 2-star pitchers are not where they once were.
No, I totally agree with you, Frank. I usually don't care as much about a 2-star pitcher because for me, first of all, especially if I'm locked in like a weekly league, if it's a 2-star pitcher, I want 2 good starts, right? Like one good start and one not like crummy start didn't really help me at all and kind of wasted at like resources or waiver position or whatever I needed just because, 2 starts. Like in a points league, sure, because, those starters get points because of whatever. 2-star pitchers are very relevant in points. But in Roto, especially in like season-long formats that aren't weekly matchups, I just don't care as much about 2-star pitchers, especially because of how often that second start might get pushed. It might get, there might be an injury. They might do all these kinds of things that I can't predict. And with how careful teams are with pitchers now, because as we heard when Stephen Lyman was on yesterday, pitching is attrition. These guys get hurt. Their playing time is not as predictable as hitters because all it takes is, one slider and all of a sudden his elbow felt something and he's okay, but we're going to push that start. It's really tough. So I just don't care that I care about 2-star pitchers if something really stands out, like they're facing 2 teams with high strikeout rates. Sure. Beyond that, I'm not getting a guy just because he has a second start.
Yeah, Brad, everything in fantasy is risk versus reward. So just kind of getting back to those 2-star pitchers, is it worth taking the risk of streaming a 2-star pitcher and this person potentially blowing up your ERA and WHIP twice in 1 week just to, rack up some of the accumulative statistics like trying to chase wins or trying to, add to your strikeout total? Is that risk worth the potential reward when it comes to streaming 2-star pitchers?
Well, I go back to this a lot, but it's situational. I have a 20-team dynasty league where I will get 2-star pitchers pretty frequently, and they're not high-quality guys, but they're useful to me because they're guys I pick specifically. They pitch long enough into the game to get wins. They pick up a couple of strikeouts, and the league's deep enough where, if a guy's hurting you a little bit on ERA, you can make it up elsewhere, and you can you don't have to be the team that wins every category because that's just the way that particular league works. In a shallower setting, I'm a little more wary of 2-star pitchers these days. For several years now, it's really hard to find guys that you don't already have rostered. They're on the waiver wire, and you can trust them to make 2 starts in a given week. There's usually some indicator. And going back to the original question about the quality of pitchers and streaming in general, I do a lot of DFS, and it's kind of like a DFS decision. You're looking at the park, the umpires, if you can get that information ahead of time, even the opponent themselves, and then really specific matchup things too, like, does the lineup skew towards mashing on ground ball pitchers versus fly ball pitchers? There's lots of little details to be going into these decisions. And when you have to make that choice for Monday and Saturday at one go, it's that much harder.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you bring up, Brad. Rudy, can you show us behind the curtain a little bit here when it comes to, you say you make up projections obviously for every single week when it comes to your in-season prep. What are some of those factors that you're looking at? Are you looking at, all right, well, this team typically performs very well against a left-handed pitcher, or this pitcher performs very well against this type of lineup? Like, what are some of those like statistical specific things that you are looking at when coming up with those weekly projections?
Yeah, so the Razzball system, which people can subscribe to, so you don't have to do this by yourself, is basically projecting, determines like probability what the lineup is and where they're going to hit. So lefty pitcher versus righty pitcher is a big determinant there. So the lineup's being configured and it's being driven by who's available. That's being done automatically. So I'm not sitting there every Friday doing projections. It's just the system automates and it refines itself. The park is obviously huge, both the park itself in terms of how it plays, as well as home versus away, because there's always home versus away splits. But I mean that and then the reality is that I've got it set to value. We know a 2-start pitcher is going to get you more win probability and Ks, and those are givens, and it's really the ERA and WHIP is the concern. You're right. There's fewer 2-start pitchers, and there's always the concern that they get pushed back. I think with the way things are with this year, with double headers, I would think it would accelerate the trend. But in general, 2-start pitching has a slight gain. But yeah, if I had to put it down, it's like the park factors themselves, home versus away, and the opposing lineups. And for a bad pitcher who's a 2-start pitcher, it almost has to be 2 home starts, and they play in an above average home park. So, not to pick on Justin Seams, but a giant pitcher is sufficient. Almost any giant pitcher if they have 2 home starts, because they're better than probably your 6th starter. But that has the price, and I know we'll get into FAB later. But it's like my process is that if he's better than my guy, I'm bidding, but I might not bid a lot if a guy's a really marginal improvement. I just won't bid a lot, but I'll be out there. And if people are going to give me cheapies, I'll take them.
Mm-hmm.
Justin, we're getting a few comments here regarding your backgrounds. Do we just have a revolving, every couple of minutes we're going to get a background change?
Yeah, I figured it's pitcher list. Why not get the background of Alex Fast in my arms?
Beautiful. A beautiful image. We've mentioned FAB a few times already, so let's go there. Basically, how to FAB. I feel like I should probably leave. Can we get Vlad Sedler in here, RotoGut on Twitter? Been regarded as the FAB whisperer, and it's such an interesting phenomenon. We've talked about setting weekly FAB and all the different types of bids that you have to do, the conditional bids. So, Justin, talk to me a little bit about what your process is. You've got, on a given year, 15 to 30 fantasy teams. How are you figuring out how much FAB to spend? Are you aggressive early on? How do you figure out who to drop? Basically, everything that goes into your decision-making and the FAB process.
Yeah, I mean, typically I'm much more conservative early on in the season. It's something I had planned on kind of changing a little bit more this year because I find myself sometimes not getting some of the early guys, the Lucas Giolito's that, kind of bust out early and then have huge dividends because you get them for a full season. But like I mentioned earlier, like this year, I think you have to be super aggressive and people are going to have, a lot of leagues aren't going to say, well, it's a half season. You only get $500 worth of FAB as opposed to $1,000. They're just going to give you $1,000. And some people will not adjust to that. And they'll be like, oh, a $10 bid is fine when they really should be throwing in a $60 bid or an $80 bid or a $100 bid on certain guys. And you're going to see lots of money thrown out early, especially if, a guy people weren't expecting to get 2 saves gets 2 saves in the first week. All of a sudden someone's dropping $300 or $400 on that guy. And so, if someone in the comments just said, JT, FAB, if you don't use it, then you lose it. And that's true. And this is going to be a year in which you're going to have to be much more aggressive. And I definitely plan on it because, obviously you want to keep some, especially if you're playing an NFBC for the long haul. So, usually by the last month of the season, I want to have spent 75 to 80% of my FAB. So obviously don't leave yourself pennies because if you're going for an overall or trying to win a league in the last month and you have no FAB, great. But yeah, I mean, I think the first month of this season, most people will have spent 60 to 70% of their FAB.
Brad, tell me a little bit about your process when it comes to figuring out, who to pick up, how much money to spend in terms of FAB, free agent acquisition budget. What's your process when it comes to this?
Well, I tend to err too conservative myself, and that's just like Justin. That is something I wanted to work on a bit this year. I usually try to. It's probably hubris, but I think I can make do with my unpopular deep cut picks. So I try to go cheap on a lot of things, and sometimes it works out, and it's very profitable. And other times I'm passing up Yordan Alvarez when I didn't need to. So that's one of the things I wanted to work on more this year. But in general, to answer your question, I try to go and stay ahead of the curve as much as you can. So looking at pitching 2 weeks out if you can, and also looking at playing time opportunities ahead of time as well. If you think that a guy might be showing signs of injury, start looking at his backups. Maybe put $1 on a backup and see if that injury turns into something and turns into an IL stint. I do a lot of bottom feeding is the moral of the story, and could really benefit from a more diversified approach.
And I think something that's really important though about that idea of bottom feeding and kind of like looking for those bargains, the human brain is wired to sort of like only think about smaller pools of things. And for a lot of people, that's going to be who's at the top of the last 7, 15, 30-day rankings in my player pool. That's like when people open up their player pool and do their waiver wire, they're going to go and sort like, okay, who has the most stolen bases in the last 15 days? And like, that's cool, but that's also where all the money's going to be spent. One great way to save money is look at people who got cut last waiver period, right? Like they're probably not doing so well right now, or they wouldn't have been cut, but go look there. I mean, a few of my wins from TGFBI last year, and like one of the few things I've ever done good at, I got 9th overall. One of the things I got was when Yuli Gurriel got cut, I saw him out there and I was like, I kind of need a corner infielder anyway. He hasn't been doing good, but there's not a lot out there. I'll just grab him. Got super lucky. He ended up, blowing up, hitting more home runs in like half season than he had in his whole career. But the other thing about knowing player pools was Bo Bichette hadn't been called up yet. But in the NFBC, because I know my rules, the only way that you can get players before they come up is if they were drafted. Then they stay in the player pool all year. If they were drafted in your league, they'll stay. So I noticed one day, I was like, I should just see if someone drafted Bo Bichette because I don't remember, right? He wasn't hitting all those fab articles because he hadn't come up yet. Boom, there he was, right? I'm bottom feeding because I'm not just looking for the best performers over the last 2 weeks. I'm looking for the actual player. Like I'm looking for players actually in my pool. Like I do look at hot performers, but just keep an eye on who's out there, who's been cut, who's out there that maybe isn't being talked about, because that's how you spend 1 versus 350 in terms of fab.
Rudy, what goes into your process when trying to figure out how much money to spend? I've talked a lot to Matt Modica about this, actually. CTM Baseball on Twitter, great high stakes player. And he was on a panel, I believe it was Thursday, talking about player debates. Rudy, something he's told me before is that he's super aggressive early on because if he finds that player that breaks out or a prospect that is going to have consistent playing time, he has that player for a larger majority of the season. So that's why he's typically more aggressive early on in the season. I mean, it's going to come back to haunt you a little bit later on, for some of the other prospects that come up, Yordan Alvarez, Bo Bichette later on in the season. But how do you weigh how aggressive you should be early on in the season, and specifically when it comes to some of those prospects?
So I think you look at every pickup in 3 categories. Are they stash worthy? Are they stream worthy? And are they keeper worthy? Anytime I'm streaming a guy, it's basically it's like a 7-day audition for whether I want to keep them on. So like last year, one was Renato Nunez had a perfect week set up. All games at home, 3 games or 4 games versus lefties. I had no plans on keeping him for more than the week. I picked him up like everywhere. He hits like 6 homers in the week. Not going to drop him after a 6-homer week. And he is serviceable as kind of like a guy. You could put him on the bench if you wanted to, but he was a pretty good corner guy DH last year. So the more a guy has a keeper feel to him, and let's say with a Lucas Giolito last year, if you felt, and like Matt's really big on this, if you felt like he made fundamental changes, I think this guy is a guy I could keep all year. Yes, you've got to. I'm totally willing to go over 10%. So I mean, $100 plus to get a guy. Last year, guys like that. I lost on it, but yeah, Yordan Alvarez was obviously one. I lost some money on Brandon Rogers because I thought that really matched up well. If you don't have that strong feeling and he's strictly a guy you could stash in hopes he gets picked up, I thought that was a really good point Scott made on guys like Bo Bichette. If you could, I did it with Kyle Tucker last year in a main event league. I don't have to bid a big amount on that. It is costing me because I got to keep him on the bench for a couple weeks potentially. So those stashes I want to go cheap on. And if it's a stream guy that like a Renato Nunez that I didn't think I was going to go for, I want those every week. I want to be able to bid on them all year. So I'm not going probably much more than like 10 to $20 on it, but I'll vary it. And yeah, this year I would hope they cut it down to like $500 fab. But otherwise, as Justin was saying, you've got to like just double what you were normally going to do. It's kind of like just a silly inflation, but
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's going to be, some people are asking in the chat, like, I don't think this is going to be a linear thing either. Like, I don't know early on if doubling it is going to work for a lot. Especially if you want to be aggressive, you're probably going to have to triple those $10 or $20 bids. I think there is something to be said for, people letting other competitors kind of blow their load too. So, I mean, this may be the year to be a little bit more conservative, at least in the first 2 or 3 fab sessions, and then start really going hard because people will overreact, especially in the small sample. But the one thing I definitely want to kind of advocate for is, with people being more aggressive in fab because of the shortened season, make sure you're setting more contingency bids than you would normally do. Because, typically halfway through a season, that's when people really start churning and burning large portions of their roster. We're starting at the halfway point this year. So you could see in some leagues, guys churning and burning their roster more, which means more players are picked up on a weekly basis than maybe you're used to. Don't leave yourself with a 0, especially if you're playing in NFBC, because that just crushes you, especially because, that would be the equivalent to a 0 in 2 straight weeks. Like, make sure you're setting as many contingency bids as your finger will allow.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, I like it's those weeks where like multiple players come out and occasionally like the top couple of guys will get bid, and having that like last guy there that you get for like $5, it wouldn't have been your first guy, but it's still an improvement and you're getting that discount for it. I think there was 1 or 2 weeks last year that were crazy. I don't know if it was is Austin Riley, Rogers, Mercado. There was just a stretch where it felt like, yeah.
I remember that. It was like Fabapalooza. It was like everyone's just blowing their fab on all these prospects, and a few of them really worked out. I mean, Oscar Mercado was a great call.
Nicky
last
Lopez
year.
Was not.
He was not, exactly.
I was going to bring up Nicky Lopez because I walked away with a lot of Nicky Lopez shares this week.
You and Prince.
Well, and someone in the chat just mentioned closers who become available will, go for a ton of money. And that's, something I think I mentioned a little bit early on. But I think it really reinforces, like, if you don't want to pay those prices for saves because, people are going to pay huge prices for them, don't leave the draft without them. And so, like, a lot of this in-season management stuff and these, questions we're having in this kind of weird shortened season can be addressed in drafts if you want. If you don't want to pay for saves this year, and I think this is year that, I never pay for saves on the waiver wire. I prefer to pay for them in draft, but I think this is definitely the year to, set yourself up so you're not having to chase maybe some of the high price things that other people will on the wire.
Yeah, always remember, specifically in roto leagues, you're going to end up paying for saves one way or another, either in the drafts or on the waiver wire through fab. So just keep that in mind. You might not want to pay the price you have to draft a closer, but at some point you're going to have to spend some fab on a closer in order to compete in that category. Scott, I want to switch gears a little bit and basically ask, in a normal season, when do you start worrying about your fantasy team? You got off to a slow start, specifically in a roto league. It's hard to kind of bounce back in some of those rate stats specifically. At what point do you start like really evaluating your team? I know in baseball, it's like normally Memorial Day, 2 months in. All right, what your season's going to look like, whether or not you're going to be a competitor or not. What is that point for you when in a normal fantasy season?
I think it depends a lot on what stats I'm doing poorly in. Like if it's across the board, like about a month in a normal season, I'm like, like I'm not good. And it's going to take a lot to come back in, these other 9 categories, right? I'm good in one, but other stats, it really depends, right? So I'm probably the least concerned about like home runs and RBIs after about a month. Like I don't want to be in last, but those are assets that I feel like I can find a lot of times in drafts. Or I'm sorry, in the waiver wire, things like that. If I need to trade, those are things that a lot of people will say, I have a lot of power. I'll give you some power, right? I'm also not quite so worried about stolen bases because you just don't need, in a normal season, there's not that many of them that you actually pile up. In terms of like, you look at the end of the season, you're like, how many stolen bases do I have? I mean, the difference between a 5th place and a 3rd place might only be a handful of saves, right? I can get those in bunches. I just need one guy to start getting hot. Out of nowhere, a guy can steal 3-4 bases in a week and move you up those rankings. But as you pointed out, the rate stats, those are things I do get really worried about, because it takes a long time to come back from a cratered batting average. And it's really hard to find decent batting average on waiver wires. So it's a lot of it is just about what stat is it, and the rate stats I'm worried about a little earlier, and then certain counting stats like home runs and stolen bases I'm a little less worried about after about a month, just because if it's in a league where I can trade, I'll go and trade for those. Should point out though, in like NFBC where I can't trade, stolen bases are like impossible to come by on the waiver wire. They're just not out there. And you do a lot of speculating on a lot of real crappy players to get steals. That's why I tend to punt them whenever I can, because they're such an independent stat. Guys who steal, like who get a lot of steals, it doesn't really, they might score some runs if they're high up in the batting order, but otherwise you can have guys who are really good that just don't steal bases. Whereas it's hard to have guys who have a lot of good attributes who also have really bad batting averages and things like that. So, copping out a little, it depends, but normally about a month is when I'm really starting, at the end of a month, I'm like, I need to do some work now. I can't just wait for it to turn.
Rudy, if you were to get off to a slow start in, say, Tout Wars Mix, you're consistently competing in that league, and you're very competitive. You're normally ranked towards the top year in and year out. If you get off to a slow start, how do you climb out of an early hole, specifically in Roto? Do you try and trade out of a strength to address a weakness? Do you just try and punt a category at that point if you realize you're not going to be able to make it up? How do you get out of that hole?
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with that. But no, I mean, I'm looking at, once I'm in season, I tend to be looking at things a lot week to week. And so every week I have a mirror that I'm looking at my dollar values and how many guys are like negative dollars for the week. And if I'm starting a guy who's negative dollars for the week, I know I'm basically in pretty bad shape. And I should be churning that guy out or doing something differently. Last year I had a rough go in an NFBC high stakes auction league where Giancarlo Stanton and David Murphy and Jose Ramirez were our 3 most highest priced bids. All I could do is basically grind week to week. I don't see you can't make it up in a week. You're just trying to, hope that the variance might switch in the next week. But I'm basically in the position of every week I'm willing to potentially drop guys if they change. I've tried to will myself to be that mindset. It's if a guy's not making his fundamentals, then just drop him and just constantly be churning. Don't ever be content whether I'm in 9th place or 3rd place or 1st place. It's tough, but and with in a trade league, that's one where if I'm high and still in bases, do I sell one out? If I have an extra closer, do I want to sell high on that, or just run it out as long as I can? Trade leagues, I'd say stolen bases. If there's something you're fundamentally bad at. Which you, as Justin mentioned, you don't. I'm a balanced drafter. I don't want to come out punting. Yeah, I've done it before. I think one year I did really well. It was I traded McCullers on high, and I got D Gordon. The last year, D Gordon was tolerable. And it worked out really well. It was some of my trades don't, but the fundamentals of it were, I do need stolen bases. I'm gonna trade one of my pitchers because I'm strong there. But it seems like as years goes on, I'm less likely to be in trading leagues, and it's more just try to be the best team you can have each week.
Brad, when it comes to trading, we've mentioned trading a decent amount the past couple of minutes. How do you approach trading just in season? Do you send an offer without saying anything to anybody, the blind offer? Do you call someone up on the phone? True story. Ian Kahn called me the day after we did our Tout Wars head-to-head points auction, and he was ready to trade the next day. And I loved it. I really appreciated it. And, you don't really see that too often. but I did appreciate it. So, when it comes to trading, what have you had the most success doing?
I do a lot of dynasty leagues, and not everyone appreciates this, but I find that trades tend to develop over months, and it's a very different feel from a redraft league where you're trying to get something done immediately. You're trying to solve a specific category immediately. Dynasty league, you're typically looking pretty far in the future when you're talking trade, and so I like to take a slow approach. I like to open with email and just say, hey, I like these guys. These are expendable pieces on my team. These are things that are maybe not as expendable, but maybe movable. Let's just start thinking about it. And some people are all about that. Some people get really pissed off at me and don't want to talk. So that's kind of my go-to with Dynasty. In a redraft, I'm more willing to just send out offers, just get something out there as a framework that we can try to build upon quickly and get it over with. Like I think everyone on this panel, I've run a lot of teams. I don't have time, especially in a redraft setting, to put in hours just to pick up 5 stolen bases. If it comes down to it, I just have to kind of write it off if someone's being that intractable and I can't get a deal there quickly.
Justin, you got yourself a new background there. The past 2 questions, what do you think? At what point in the season do you start to worry? I guess in a typical season, because this year, it could be the first week and, you're going to start worrying because it's just a shorter season in general. But, when do you start to worry typically, and how do you approach trades?
Typically, I'm not going to get overly worried until about Memorial Day. So, 2 months into the season? Obviously, that's going to change quite a bit this year. But just because I'm not worried about where my overall standings are until about that point doesn't mean I'm not worried about individual players. So, there's a huge distinction. Making sure I'm keeping track of individual players' performance, what's going on with them, gives you warning signs that, okay, this guy is the reason why my team is in 8th place on Memorial Day. Is an important part of my process. In terms of trading, I've said this a million times, is trading is like being in a relationship. If you screw your partners over too much, you're going to end up just by yourself. And I think often people want to win trades, and we see this in the fantasy industry a lot, and it's why you don't see a lot of mega deals often in the industry, in industry leagues, is because people don't want to lose trades or they want to win trades. And that's a really awful way of going into a trading process. And if you become that guy in your league that is always, taking advantage of people via trades, people aren't going to want to play with you. People aren't going to want to trade with you. And there are definitely guys that I have in long-term leagues that they'll offer me a trade. And I tell them, I will never trade with you. I don't like the way you operate. And so, you want to be good to people so that way they're good to you later on. And I just think that's a better way to operate.
Especially the people that text you incessantly and they're like, here's the reason why you should make the trade. If you ever have to do that, it's already downhill at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No explaining your trades, please.
Yeah.
We all know what we're doing. We're all big boys here. Scott, I wanted to ask you, have you had any success punting in a roto league?
Yeah, it's one of the few times I've had success. Now, a lot of that is probably luck, but I did that in TGFBI last year. I punted stolen bases, but I should point out that I didn't go into it planning to punt stolen bases. It's one of those things that if you're going to punt, it's usually because that kind of happened to you. Every time I wanted to get stolen bases, those players got taken in the draft. And so I was kind of stuck. I was like, I'm not going to reach, 2-3 rounds on a guy just for stolen bases when there's a very good player I like. And so, by probably somewhere between rounds 10 and 15, I realized oh, I guess I'm punting stolen bases because there aren't any left, right? They're gone. So, I will punt a lot more aggressively in weekly, head-to-head category leagues, because there's things that are really fluky. If you punt batting average, you still might win batting average sometimes, because when Joey Gallo gets hot. He doesn't hit 200 every week. There's those weeks that he hits 800, right? Because he just finds a bunch of balls that he can pull to the left side. So that, that changes things up a little bit. But yeah, I will punt. It does affect like my trading, like I have to kind of tell people like, yeah, I don't really care if like I'm in last in that category by a ton. I'm not really interested in trading up to get like 10, I'm not trading up to go from 12th to 11th, right? Like that kind of thing. And I do want to point out something I thought that was really important about what Brad was talking about when he does trades. It is key to at least like tell people where you're starting from. The one thing that kills me, and I know it's just a trade etiquette thing, kills me when they just say, is this player available? What do you want for him? Like, oh, I got a lot of leagues, man. Like, I don't have time to spend. Like Brad was saying, like, and Rudy, like, I don't have time to spend a bunch of hours looking at your roster, looking at the other offers I could make to other teams, looking at the waiver wire, how I would get those stats. Like, the human brain is designed to only look at like a few things at a time and categorize them. Tell me who you'd be willing to give up, and then we can talk. And again, it can be a long time. Sometimes we might just have to look and say, like, there's not a trade here. Sorry. There's mutual interest in these players, but there's not a fit. Sorry. And that's like the biggest thing I learned was just kind of telling people, hey, I just don't see this happening, instead of arguing with people about how we can make it work. Like, it was easier to just say, sorry, nothing here. We'll just move on. Check back in a month.
Justin, I feel like we have to end with this. We're coming up on the top of the hour here. How do you handle injuries? I saw that you got flamed by Rob Silver the other day. What's the best way to handle injuries in a minute? Go.
I mean, don't draft a bunch of injured players like I did on my main event team. And I mean, people like to make the jokes. People also forget, like, I had 18 of my 23 players get hit by injury last year on my main event team. So the fact I drafted 3 was not like as big of a deal as just the bad luck I got. But I think this is like, I'm being very, very cautious with the injured players. And I know a lot of people coming into the season, well, they've had time to rest. We also have no idea what kind of rehab they're doing or what kind of shape they're in. And like, that's going to be a lot of risk, and you're not going to be able to overcome them this year. It's just, you're not going to have the time to stash those guys. So like, if you're the type of person who goes in a draft, goes, oh, I'm going to stash 2 guys, I don't think that this is a year for that.
Rudy, Scott, Brad, Justin, you guys are all rock stars. It was great doing this with you. Let's welcome in Nick Pollock, get him back in here. This was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it, guys. Nick, what's going on, man?
Oh, guys, that was fantastic. And I just want to appreciate Justin Mason for putting his head right where he is with that photo. No, yeah, much better. There you go. No, really, guys, this was a fantastic panel. And Rudy, does not surprise me, of course, that you never play from behind. That makes perfect sense to me. We have just a quick moment here. What would you guys say has been the best move that you've made in recent memory? Like the best fab you went for, or just the best move in season that you can think of? Starting with you, Frank.
Oh man, the one that comes to mind is easily the worst move. So I'll just give you the worst one that I've made. And last year I dropped like $350 in my NFBC main event league on Carter Keyboom. And we all know how that wound up. So that is one that comes to mind immediately. I've really had to do some like off-season like self-reflection to like try and forgive myself and forgive Carter Keyboom, because I want to be back in on him this year. But that is one that comes to mind immediately. Spent a ton of fab on him. And that's an example of how, spending up for prospects doesn't always work.
Right. That's great. Quickly, Brad, what do you got?
Juan Soto, the year he came up. I have no idea how I did this, but 2 weeks ahead of when he came up, I had no reason to be rostering him. He was ages away from the majors, but I picked him up in a bunch of leagues. I recommended him some articles, and turned out golden. And I don't know how it happened. I don't think I could replicate it, but it was definitely the best move I've ever made.
That was fantastic. Justin Mason is apparently in the show. How about you?
I mean, I grabbed Mike Trout the year he, came up and just went absolutely off. And I spent $1 more in fab than the other guy who was going for him. I think I spent $29, and it was an AL only keeper league, so I got to keep him for those $29 for the next 2 years. But I mean, I more remember the bad ones, like Frank said. Like I remember, I traded $1 Chris Sale in that same AL only league for JD Drew. Like, you know, and he's a rookie. And there's all these concerns about his, you know, throwing motion and everything. He was skinny, you know, and like, yeah, I mean, that guy long-termed him and had him for like a decade. It was awful.
That's crazy. How about you, Scott?
Actually, it was the one time I got really aggressive in Fab last year, TGFBI. I knew I needed a pitcher because like my pitching had been good, but it was all like smoke and mirrors. And I listened to this guy at this place I work who does this podcast all the time named Nick. And he kept saying like, I really like this Zach Galen guy. Like he's coming up, he's been doing pretty good. And I was like, he's out there. I probably dumped like $360 in Fab because I was like, I had to do it. I had to get him because I hadn't scouted a lot of pitchers at that moment. And it seemed like that guy in the podcast had. And worked out great. If I remember his last name, I'll let you know.
Yeah, please do. I don't know who would ever say Galen though. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Rudy,
I would never work with a guy like who would do that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's guys that the ones that like truly stand out are the ones that you get on every team.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I got at least one Gallon last year, and I got a Lance Lynn last year. And like was kicking myself for the teams that I didn't. I think I got outbid like $2 to $1 in labor, which is $100. So it wasn't being super cheap. But I got Whit Merrifield for $1 everywhere that year. The year he came up out of nowhere, and I don't remember who was the second baseman he was supplanting. It was maybe it was like a young Mondesi. I don't know. But yeah, Merrifield for $1 in like $1,000 leagues, $1,000 Fab leagues. Yeah, awesome. That was nice. And then, I traded him for I traded for Tylon to Pianowski in labor. That killed me. But that was one where like I had him in 3 other leagues, so it's still like a net benefit. But
sure, definitely.
The bad ones always stick in your craw.
Yeah, of course. Anyway, guys, really, thanks so much for being a part of this. It's fantastic. I have so many talented people just right in front of me right now. It was a great panel. Loved it. And really, thanks again for being a part of PitchCon.
Hey, Nick, before you kick us all out, I'd like to add a TGFBI entry to your prize pool.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, definitely. We'll do that right at the $10,000 mark if you can do that. TGFBI, wow, that's huge. So really, thanks so much for that, Mason. Hopefully we can get there. We're about 1,800 away right now. We've had some donations recently. Fantastic. We are so close. We're about 2-3 hours away from closing that. So hopefully we can hit it. We've got all these crazy things like Eno Sars being your fantasy consultant for the year is just crazy. So really, again, thank you so much for all your support and being here. It means a lot to me.
Eno will also send you every sandwich recipe he's
yeah, without a doubt.
And every beer he's drank.
Yeah, beer recommendations too.
All right, take care, guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Take it easy.
All right.